Story 1. It happened years ago, but I still remember it clearly. I was driving through a rural area. I had been warned about driving in this part of the country during the winter, but I had underestimated the severity of the fog. It was like being swallowed whole by a ghostly cloud. The feeling of isolation overwhelming. I was thinking the scenic route would keep me awake, but it was a big mistake. The first sign that something wasn't right came when my passenger side headlight went out without warning. I realized the remaining light wasn't enough to cut through the fog. High beams were used, scattering the light into a blinding white wall. I had to crawl along at barely 15 miles per hour, squinting into the dense gray. I hadn't passed a house, a gas station, or even another car in what felt like hours. Then the engine started making an odd noise. A strained metallic whine. Almost immediately the check engine light blinked. I pulled over onto the road that was barely wide enough for 2 cars. On either side was nothing but fog and darkness. I got out of the car and the still silence was unnerving. No wind, no animals, just an oppressive stillness. I opened the hood and peered at the engine. I'm decent with electronics, but I don't know a thing about fixing cars. I tightened what I could and checked the few things that I actually recognized. When I got back in and turned the key, the car gave a sad sputter before falling silent. It was dead, and of course my cell phone had no service. I leaned back in the driver's seat and laughed bitterly. Everything about the situation felt like a setup for some low-budget horror movie. A dense fog, a dead car, no cell service, and no sign of life. The cliches were piling up. I won't wandering off into the fog like some horror movie's victim, so I decided to wait it out. I reclined my seat, pulled my jacket tighter around me, and resolved to take a nap until sunrise. When I woke up, the sun was just starting to burn away the fog. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and immediately froze. I wasn't parked on the side of a desolate road anymore. Instead, I was in the middle of what looked like the main street of a small town. Neatly kept houses lined both sides of the road. I stared in disbelief. I had been certain I was in the middle of nowhere. There hadn't been a single light on during the night and no sign of civilization at all. Where had this town come from? I stepped out of the car and looked around. Everything was eerily still. No birds chirping. No hum of air conditioners. Not even the swing was moving. About 50 yards down the road, I spotted a small service station with an old-fashioned gas pump. I feel relieved and made my way over there immediately. The man behind the counter looked perfectly normal. I explained my situation and he nodded as if this sort of thing happened all the time. He followed me back to the car. He asked me to try starting the car. My car roared to life on the first try. Even both of headlights were working perfectly. The mechanic shrugged and said must have just been the cold. I didn't argue and thanked him. I got back in the car and drove away as quickly as I could without looking back. The weirdest part, one never got the name of the town. I tried finding it on a map later, retracing my route as best I could, but it was like the place didn't exist. Story 2. When I was 12 years old and it was late July 1992. My family had found this perfect campsite next to a stream. The kind of place you see in camping magazines. Tall pines, clear water burbling over rocks. Nothing felt off about the place. That evening, we'd done all the classic camping things like eating around the campfire, singing, making s'mores, stargazings, and ghost stories that seemed silly in the moment. When it was time for bed, I got into my sleeping bag and listening to music while my brother Rick read his book. It must have been around 11 o'clock when I decided to call it a night. I remember the exact moment everything changed. I'd just taken off my headphones and was drifting off when I became aware of a sound. It was subtle at first. Just a light swishing or scratching against the tent exterior. My first thought was that it must be grass moving in the wind. But then I realized something that made my stomach drop. There wasn't any wind. The air was completely still. The sound continued, methodical and deliberate. Like someone or something dragging their fingers across the tent surface. "Rick," I whispered. "What is that?" "What's what?" he asked, lowering his book. I pointed toward the sound, which was now moving slowly along the side of the tent. Rick reached out and tapped the spot with his hand, probably thinking the same thing I had about grass or a loose skyline. What happened next is burned into my memory. Whatever was out there immediately tapped back, matching the exact rhythm of my brother's tap. The sound was sharp and distinct. Nothing like grass or branches. We lost it. Both of us started screaming, scrambling backward in our sleeping bags. The scratching got more intense. moving faster around the tent wall. I can still hear the sound like dry fingers dragging across nylon. But somehow wrong, like the timing between scratches was just slightly off from what it should have been. My parents came from their tent. Dad kept saying it had to be a bug or some vegetation caught in the tent's exterior. Mom suggested it might be a guideline tapping against the tent. They were trying to be rational to calm us down. But I could hear the uncertainty in their voices. Dad walked around outside of the tent with his flashlight, examining every inch. Nothing. No branches. No loose strings. No large insects. They even took everything out of the tent and shook it, thinking something might be caught in the fabric. But there was nothing. The scratching had a pattern to it that still haunts me sometimes. Once Rick tried to time the pattern with his watch, thinking maybe it was something mechanical we couldn't see. But the timing was never consistent. It was erratic yet deliberate, random, yet purposeful, like it was trying to communicate something we couldn't understand. I was hysterical by this point. Even as 12 years old, I knew this wasn't normal. This wasn't the wind or a bug or any of the logical explanations my parents were trying to find. Mom finally took me to their tent, while Dad stayed with Rick. I didn't sleep at all that night. Dad, who was always the skeptic in our family, he tried to approach it scientifically, marking the spots where the scratching was strongest with his flashlight beam. By morning, he had mentally mapped out its movements. But the pattern made no sense. It defied any natural movement pattern he knew of. No animal moves that way. He said nothing moves that way. Dad was convinced we'd find scratches, tears, or at least some kind of mark that would explain what we'd heard. But the tent surface was pristine. Not a single scratch or scuff mark anywhere. We packed up and left after that quick examination of the tent. In the morning, no one suggested staying another night. Story 3. 7 years ago, I went through one of the most stressful periods of my life. At that time, I started having a recurring nightmare. In the dream, a pitch-black parasite clung to my chest, sucking the life out of me. It felt heavy, like it was pulling something vital from deep inside me. The worst part was that I never saw it come or go. It would just be there, waiting in the dark corners, lurking until I went to bed every night. The dream played out the same way. I'd feel paralyzed, unable to scream or move, as the parasites latched onto me, draining my energy. I'd wake up gasping, clutching my chest and drenched in sweat. It always left me feeling completely exhausted, as if whatever life it took in the dream carried over into the real world. What made it even stranger were my cats. Normally, they each had their own sleeping spots. One preferred the couch, another liked the windowsill, and the last would hide under the coffee table. But during this time, they all started sleeping on my bed every night. Without fail, all three would crowd around me, curling up close to my chest. It was like they were standing guard surrounding me, as if they knew something I didn't. At first I found it comforting, like they were trying to help me through a tough time. But as the nightmares got worse, their behavior started to feel eerie. They were always alert, their heads snapping toward every small creak or shadow. I couldn't help but wonder, were they protecting me from whatever was in my dream? The nightmares weren't the only thing bothering me. During the day, I developed this itch right in the center of my chest, the same spot where I felt the parasite in my dream. I scratched at it constantly, but the itch never went away. I tried to tell myself it was just stress or maybe some weird allergic reaction. But deep down, it felt like something more. Then one day, while rubbing at the itch, I felt it, a small-sized lump just beneath the skin on my chest. A chill ran down my spine. It was right in the exact place where the parasite latched on in my nightmare. I tried to brush it off, hoping it would disappear on its own. But the itch persisted and the lump didn't budge. Eventually I gave in and scheduled a doctor's appointment. I needed peace of mind, even if it was just to prove to myself that it was nothing. When the doctor examined the lump, I noticed their expression change. They ordered a biopsy immediately. "It's probably nothing, but we need to be sure," they said. A few days later the results is out. I was diagnosed with male breast cancer. At the age of 28, the news hit me hard, like a punch I never saw coming. The next few months were a blur: treatments, surgeries, hospital visits. It was exhausting in every way imaginable. But I fought through it, determined to get better. And then something strange happened. After my treatment ended, I was officially cancer-free. The nightmare stopped just like that. I never had the dream again. It felt like the parasite in my dream had been waiting for me to find the lump. And once I did, its purpose was fulfilled. Even stranger, my cats went back to their usual routines. The moment I recovered, they stopped sleeping on my bed. It was as if their job was done. I'll never fully understand what happened during that time. But I'm grateful for how it all played out. I caught the cancer early, fought through it and got a second chance at life. But I'll always feel a strange gratitude toward those 3 cats, who somehow knew exactly when I needed them the most.